Okay, good morning, everyone. I've got a ton of slides, so I'm going to kind of try to rush through them a little bit. I didn't think I was going to do that until I saw the flying Nerfatron or whatever it's called, but it's probably wiser. So really quickly, who we are. So I'm from a small company called Thinkst in South Africa. We've been doing security consulting stuff for a really long time. The talk's put together by myself and Marco Slaviero, who's also a researcher at Thinkst. And essentially what we do is we build stuff and we do security research. The question, I guess, is why this talk? One of the things is the first talk of the day is supposed to be a little bit different and get you thinking a little bit differently. And seeing as how all of us have just committed 2 days of our lives to a security conference, I figured it would make sense to stand up here and tell you guys why we're probably doing it wrong. So earlier this year at B-Sides, Christian Ryu, Dildog from Veracode, did a talk. And he did a really interesting thing where he went through the different stages of his life. And along with his receding hairline, he basically went through what his motivation at the time was. And said when you just start in the industry, you want to get a job, and then you want to get into the media, and then you want to do the impossible, and then eventually you get to the point where you really want to make a difference, where you want to make sure that the industry is doing the right stuff. And I think this kind of happens as you get older. For the last bit, I've been doing some talks on stuff that I think we need to fundamentally change in the industry, or places where I think we've gone wrong seriously. So a few years ago, I did a talk called Fig Leaf Security, and the thrust of it was that we're doing things pretty wrong, and we seem to be hiding behind arbitrary fig leaves. The 44Con talk that Steve mentioned, I basically used as a soapbox to say what we're doing with penetration testing today is a little bit wrong. And then at BrewCon, I gave this talk on you and your research, which was largely plagiarized from Richard Hamming's paper of the same name. And if you've not read it, you should go read it. So why security conferences? Like, why a talk on security conferences? And in honesty, probably the biggest reason was we thought it would be interesting. Okay, so we went off a few years ago, and we started collecting security conferences. And essentially what this meant is we went back as far as we could go, scoured the internet, paid a whole bunch of interns. And today we've got literally thousands of conferences and thousands of speakers all categorized in a database, allowing us to now do some sort of stats and some sort of trending on what people are talking about at any given time. So we thought it would be interesting. And for the most part, you guys are kind of a captive audience. Like, you're not going anywhere. So we figured we'd just unleash the talk on you. But one of the things that is true is that security conferences kind of become an interesting proxy for the security world itself. Okay, you can see lots of the stuff that we managed to get right, or lots of the stuff that we managed to do wrong, just by looking at what's going on with security conferences. And so if we go to my premise in Fig Leaf Security, which was largely simplistic, I was basically saying that with InfoSec, we're sucking, and that it's largely our fault. Okay, and if we go back to what I was saying earlier, as we get older, or as the industry matures, we kind of want to make sure that we're making a difference instead of just making a noise. Okay, and so probably the last reason for looking at security conferences is because there's lots of complaints about them. Okay, much to Steve and Trey's dismay, almost after every conference, you're bound to find a whole bunch of people giving you their schooled opinions on Twitter, on Facebook, on why the conference sucked. And this is interesting. And one of the things we have to watch for, though, is in InfoSec, complaining is kind of what we do. Okay, so we kind of complain about anything anyway. And so what we were trying to figure out is whether there's any real need for the complaints. Okay, so what we're trying to do with this talk is figure out what's there that needs fixing, what's the stuff we should just accept, and which stuff is just bike shedding. Bike shedding, you guys aware of the phrase? Okay, So it goes back, it's got its roots in what's called Parkinson's law of triviality, which basically says if there was a meeting called on how to build a nuclear reactor and how to build a bike shed, because the nuclear reactor is big, expensive, and requires specialized skills, it gets passed in 5 minutes. And because everyone's got an opinion on the bike shed, that will take up the rest of the meeting. Okay, and that's largely what happens for lots of things. It explains most open source mail lists also. So really quickly, stuff that we won't cover, okay, we're not going to do any discussion on the whole booth babe problem. I don't think there's much to discuss. It's pretty black and white. We're not going to talk about whether Conference X sold out or jumped the shark. We're not going to talk about conference food, venue, Wi-Fi, or any of that. Okay, we'll start really simple, which is there's a lot of conferences. Okay, and so the number is interesting. And so back in 2010, we put together this infographic when it first occurred to us. And really simply, it shows you the dramatic rise in conferences, the number of conferences between the early 90s and then 2010. Okay, and already you could see the massive spike in the number of conferences going on. The graph's not cumulative, so you're actually seeing an increase in numbers. Okay, and that trend continues today. So you'll see it's not changing. Okay, the spike still goes up. And it's not just the number of conferences, right? It's also the scale of conferences. So Black Hat in 97 had something like 30 speakers, and Black Hat in 2010 has a lot of speakers. Okay, you're averaging around 150, I think. And we thought it was interesting, but in truth, when we did that infographic, we spent most of our time coming up with the name of the infographic. Okay, and we ended up with CTEC Conformone, which is just in case any of you like sneakers and remember too many conferences, and it doesn't quite apply, but we used it anyway. And so the question that has to come up is this unique to us? Like, is this just our problem? Okay, and a quick Google will show you that back in the crypto world, way back in 2009, people were complaining, do we have too many conferences? Okay, so you start to think, well, maybe it's just an information security thing. And then the Wall Street Journal has a talk that says, are doctors attending too many conferences? And you think, well, maybe that's where the similarity ends, except you see the punchline is, doctors attend far too many conventions. Constant meetings have brought a false sense of urgency to medical issues. Doesn't sound familiar at all. Okay, and maybe it's just the hard sciences, but no. If you see the philosophy guys, they complaining, too many conferences. Okay, a gajillion conferences across the world, hyper-specialized topics by invitation with sketchy review procedures. Okay, so the stuff seems to be pretty common. But what's the core of the complaint? Like, is there something worth complaining about? And Thomas Lim gave a keynote at Infiltrate, for those of you who saw it. And straight from his slides, Thomas said, we have too many cons, too few good speakers to go around, too many repeat presentations, and his premise then is that all of this brings down the quality of conferences worldwide. Now, Thomas has like 10 years of experience organizing conferences. Okay, and his thesis there is that we have poorer cons because of all these repeats. And because we've got all of this data, we can start doing some sort of checking, at least on the stuff that's hard and fast. And one of the things that's interesting is you see that in 98, we had a bit of a jump with repeated conference talks were at their lowest at around 2%. But almost since then, we've kind of stuck at around 10% repeated talks. Okay, so while there's lots of talks happening, the number of repeated talks hasn't dramatically changed over the last decade or so. And something that's interesting is, if you really think about it, the whole repeated talk thing is not really our problem. It's a conference organizer problem. Okay, conference organizers have this, this pride about only having original content. But if you're a guy who attended a talk in London, which was also given in Vegas, it really doesn't make a difference to you that it wasn't the first time that the presenter gave that talk. Okay, so Thomas is right about one thing. There is this massive conference growth. It's worth trying to figure out why. Where's this growth actually coming from? The simple one is the industry's grown, right? In 2000, there weren't a lot of people who did computer security for a living, and now there are. Okay, and one of the other interesting changes is just globalization. Okay, if you just look at the number of locations that conferences were being held in, okay, it used to be a very, very confined, very small space. But over time, you'll see that that stuff spreads. So while you certainly see America dominating in terms of the number of conferences, it's also clear that there's now conferences almost everywhere in the world. And if you leave it long enough, that'll keep growing. Okay, and an interesting trend that's come up is the birth of the smaller conferences. Okay, I think 44Con actually counts as relatively big. If you take some of the B-sides, some of the conferences you see in locations like Africa, you'll see really small events. Okay, and the question is what this results in. Interestingly, there's some positives. Okay, you can attend a good high-quality con without having to travel, without worrying about accommodation charges. There's opportunities for up-and-comers, and then there's things like the Security Vacation Club. Okay, which, if you're not aware of, is been allowing security researchers to travel the world and see the world beyond their monitors for at least the last 5 years or so. But it has downsides also. Okay, and one of the big downsizes is the drop in the ratio of signal to noise. Okay, today there's just so many conferences going on at any given time, you kind of don't know what to focus on. And another interesting side effect is that we've lost a relatively high-value marker in terms of conference speaker. Okay, so there was a time where someone was a conference speaker and you'd be relatively sure that he kind of knows what he's talking about. And these days, it's almost meaningless. You do a Twitter search for Twitter bios that include conference presenter or conference speaker in their title, and you'll find it show up all over the show. So the question that has to come up is, why are so many people deciding to run conferences? Okay, and I help run one in South Africa, so I can tell you, and over the years I've met many guys from around the world who have nothing but the noblest of intentions. And so I can tell you there are a large crew of people who do it because they're noble, because they want to advance the industry or advance the state of the art. But I'm not talking about those saints for now. So the one question that comes up is it profitable? Okay, and this is kind of interesting. I've only been involved in nonprofits. What I can tell you, running a nonprofit is it's surprisingly hard to not take money. So we run a small conference in South Africa called ZACon. And one of the problems we've actually had is being worried about breaking relationships with people who desperately want to give us money to advertise, and we just don't want to take their money because we don't want to go down that road. It's a nice problem to have. So most people will tell you that it's not profitable. Again, I'll go back to Thomas Lim here because I really don't know. But you'll see Thomas actually makes a point at some point on Twitter saying, hey, Black Hat, if you're really for the community, then why charge so much and profit so much? Okay, you've got to kind of take that with a pinch of salt because later in his talk, Thomas talks about how many of his conferences actually run at a loss. Okay, so not all conferences are running for profit, and we don't have that many saints, so why do the other guys do it? Okay, well, one of the answers is influence. Okay, and like most things in InfoSec today, if someone's going to make a good point, chances are Moxie Marlinspike's already made this point, and he's done it profoundly. And Moxie sent a mail to the Daily Dave mailing list at some point, where Dave Vitale was slating people who had paid for keynotes at a conference. So Dave was kind of sitting on a high horse saying, hey, look at this conference, they did a paid keynote from Fortinet. And Moxie struck back in kind of a Moxie way, saying, keep in mind that running a conference does come with a certain amount of power. Okay, even if you're not paid, the ability to choose which talks are submitted allows conference organizers to kind of define a narrative. Okay, and he doesn't pull any punches. He goes a little further and says, look, Infiltrate don't need to accept paid keynotes because in truth, your talk's already submitted to support Immunity's business model. Okay, in some ways, so he says, look, Black Hat did have a paid keynote, but Immunity's conference is one big advert for Immunity. Okay, and essentially what he was saying is, let's just be honest about it. And probably the first takeaway for us here is for us to just keep in mind that conference organizers, researchers, and attendees have different incentives. Okay, this is something that's going to come up a few times during the talk. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's something that you need to be aware of. Okay, and so the other thing that always comes up the moment you're talking about security conferences is the question of bias. Okay, this is not a new problem. Almost after every conference, you'll find someone who works heavily on the defensive side of the industry tweet, blog post, or complain on Facebook about the fact that conferences are heavily skewed towards attack and not doing enough on defense. Okay, in truth, if you look at conferences and try to do a breakdown, splitting between attack and defense, it's certainly empirically true. Okay, more talks are given on offense than on defense. But the more important question is why, okay, why this happens. And probably the biggest reason that people throw out is because offense is sexy, okay? And Gary McGraw always talks about the NASCAR effect, that people want to see crashes, and crashes are more interesting. I think that's a bit dodgy because nobody except Americans actually watch NASCAR, but you can take his point. But I think most of these guys are wrong. And if I had to submit a guess for why this exists, I think the answer is an economic one, and comes through with a question of incentivization. Okay, and the simple thing, certainly for me here, is that attackers don't really have another path to market. Okay, if I invent a cool way to stop some attack from working, chances are I'm going to start selling that solution. So I don't talk about it. Okay, you don't see Invincia standing up and giving you a talk on how they can defend you. You just see them trying to sell you their put a person in a bubble. Okay, but if I invent a new way to do some new zero-day attack, the easiest thing for me to do is to show you all how clever I am, and then try to get you to hire me for consulting. Okay, we'll see how this changes as we see selling zero-day get bigger and bigger, and selling offense get bigger and bigger. The next thing that comes up pretty consistently is how broken the review process is. Okay, and every year, without fail, you'll get complaints after conference acceptance time about how the conference organizers have done it wrong. Okay, and some years the complaints are slightly more than others. Okay, so this year, for those of you who weren't watching the internet dramas, Charlie Miller, well-respected researcher, done lots of good stuff, was slightly annoyed that his and Chris Velasek's talk didn't get accepted for Black Hat Vegas. Okay, and so it wasn't just him. Okay, there were a bunch of other people, and you see the stuff if you watch Twitter closely, a whole bunch of people complaining, hey, my talk didn't make it through. I've seen other people giving a similar talk. How did they get in? How did I not get in? It happens. And some of the mistakes are more visible than others. Okay, Ben Nagy, never a wallflower, came out very quickly to call it or to question the level of head-in-assery that'll allow you to pass up on Charlie's submission. But in truth, if I were on the Black Hat committee and passed up on Charlie's talk, just based on how Charlie's talk went after that, it's probably safe to say we goofed. Like maybe that one should have made it in or made the cut. Okay, but the simple answer is this stuff happens. Okay, how do you fix it? Like many things in InfoSec, everyone's got an opinion on the fact that it's broken. The question is, where do you go from there? How should conference acceptance be done? And what's kind of interesting in the Charlie Miller case is Charlie complained, and a whole bunch of people gave their opinions, and most of the people were giving diametrically opposed opinions on how to fix it. Okay, so if you paid attention, Charlie was basically saying, hey, if you guys didn't think my CFP was clear, you should have checked with me. you know I've done this before, you know I'm good for it. Okay? And one of the biggest other opinions was, look, stupid conferences, they don't do blind review. Okay? Blind review and I'm Charlie Miller, ask me, are diametrically opposed opinions. Okay? You can't have them both. Okay? And everyone who was pro-academic kind of backed the blind review process until Sergey Bratis came up and said, let's be honest, even this blind review thing is bunk. You read the paper and you know where it's coming from. Let's not act like it's totally blind. Okay, and at this point, I had added to the conversation saying, listen, the reason we can't get this answer simply is because of these mixed incentives. Okay, and what happened here is a whole bunch of people started talking about how blind review is the way to go. And then a whole bunch of other people said, hey, listen, conferences are not about getting the best paper out or getting the best research out necessarily. In part, conference organizers have to make sure that attendees are entertained. And Ben Nagy kind of killed the conversation pretty dead by saying, look, all you guys who want the blind review, you do your blind review conference, and I'll do my conference just based on speaker names, and let's see who sells more tickets. Okay, and it's an ugly truth, but it's true. And it's something that we need to keep in mind. Nico Weissman came out and said, look, what you should do is do a review, and then for every person who speaks, give him a 15-minute WebEx with questions and answers. Okay, and again, that got killed pretty quickly by Ben saying Black Hat had something like 800 submissions this year. Okay, Trey will tell you the numbers wrong, but I think the point kind of holds. Okay, and Nico actually goes back and says, yeah, look, that sounds good in utopia. In reality, it's not going to happen. Okay, and I think, again, what we see simply here is a question of economics. Okay, we've got mismatched incentives. Researchers want a way for good research to win. Conference organizers want a way to get people to come into conferences. And attendees want, I'm not really sure at this point. Like, I'll get into it a little later, but I think for the most part, to be entertained. Okay, and I think if there's somewhere that we need to fix something, I think it's there. But it does kind of explain some of the trends that we see. So it explains the trend of the rock star speakers. Okay, I've literally been at talks, at Kaminsky talks, and they're always entertaining. And Dan does great research on the back of it, so I'm not slagging his research. But I've seen talks of his where people in the crowd are literally not listening to him, like they're talking to you. And then at a point, a terminal comes up with some green writing, and the guy goes, woo, and lifts his hand up because that's all he was there for, right? He saw a shell, and something cool must have happened. Okay, and the other thing that it gives you is the rise of stunt hacking, right? Which is, I take something like, can I find buffer overflows in the code that landed the lunar launcher or the lunar module? And I get to give a talk, and it's cool, and it gets headlines because someone can say that attacker from Africa could have hacked the space program or something like that. Okay, but those things are short-lived, and they give you the headline, and everybody forgets about it instantly. And Michael Zalewski, who's a very strong researcher, came out really strongly at some point on a mail list and basically slated everyone across the board. He said there's no honest brokers in this whole deal. On the one hand, guys are just trying to make money. On the other hand, guys are just trying to make a name for themselves. Let's forget about it and talk about stuff that's more interesting. But what's interesting, or what's important, I think, is for us to understand what everyone's role in it is. And in truth, it might be okay as long as we're still covering the right topics and as long as we're still learning, okay? So I guess the next question for us to ask is, are we covering the right topics? Okay, and if you leave Marco with the data set that we've now got of all these talks going back all these years, he starts to play with n-gram things and starts to do statistical analysis on the stuff. And again, what's clear is if you go through the topics over time, you can see that attack is a favorite. Okay, you can see that it dominates clearly. But what I think is interesting is if you start looking at some n-grams over time, You can see, for example, in 2002, antivirus had its peak. Okay, at that point, they had solved all our problems. Those guys were riding high and giving all the talks on it. IDS also had a nice peak at that point when they had the world solution, and then they disappeared. One of the things that I think is interesting if you look at that trend is looking at web applications. Okay, and web apps actually made a really late spike considering when web apps started dominating. And if you guys remember why this is, one of the things you'll remember is that attacking web apps just weren't that cool. Okay, web app hacking was kind of a second-class citizen. It was overflows and exploits and those guys playing with Perl, CGI, and SQL insertion, okay, until this actually started owning the planet. Okay, and you start to see that for a bunch of different titles. For example, client-side attacks, which dominate our attack space today. Okay, if you've got an environment and you're trying to protect your organization, you probably aren't that worried about attacks against IIS anymore. Okay, it's how you're protecting your client side from getting owned that's causing you to stay up at night. But even client sides came into the conference scene really late. Okay, because for a long time, client-side attacks were just not cool. Okay, the original pwn to own didn't even count a client-side attack as a first-class win. It was a second-class win if the guy had to surf to your page to get owned. XSS had kind of the same thing. Okay, so the attack was known about for a long time. It just didn't start getting talked about till cool kids started doing it. And of course, sometimes you get outliers. So what you're looking at there is APT. Okay, it just didn't exist until it did. Okay, and the one that's clearly on the rise right now, I'll just leave this here, that's cyber war or war. Okay, but in truth, if you look at all these graphs and we're honest with ourselves, you don't see a bunch of guys looking forward and predicting the future. Okay, for the most part, we're pretty driven by the trends that happen to be burning at that point, and then we move on as quickly as we can. Okay, and if I asked as whether we're covering the right topics, I think that one's dodgy. And I guess the next question is, well, hey, are we learning? And I think at this point, we have to start getting honest with ourselves. And because that's hard, I'll look away for a little bit. Everyone's familiar with TED Talks. Okay, everyone goes and watches the occasional TED Talk. Some of them are super entertaining. Some of them are really good. And like all talks, they get a whole bunch of hate. Okay, so if you go on to Quora, there's a really interesting thread on why do TED Talks actually suck. Okay, and you'll see a few interesting answers. And I like this one because it says that people seem to think that listening to a 20-minute talk is actually an intellectual endeavor when it's not. Okay, and you see that thread come up a lot. And one of the things they say is, look, you got to keep in mind there's only so much you can learn in 20 minutes or in 60 minutes. It's just not built for deep education. And I like this guy's answer, which says, it makes you think you've learned stuff, when in actual fact you haven't. Okay, it offers the illusion of an alternative to good old-fashioned hard work. And one of the points that I'm putting forward is that this is what we're doing with conferences in general. Okay, it makes us think that we're doing something and makes us think that we're doing it and it counts as work, but I'm not sure it really counts. In fact, if we look at popularity versus difficulty, with early Black Hat talks that I used to attend, like in the early 2000s, you could kind of see the talks that did deep dives based on the inverse relationship to the number of people who were in the room. Okay, so popular talks were popular, and tough talks had like 5 or 6 guys, maybe 10 guys actually sitting in them. It's almost a perfect inverse relationship. But let's not do that. Let's make this tangible. Show of hands, how many of you here remember the big brouhaha that happened 2007? There was a talk called Don't Tell Joanna the Virtualized Rootkit is Dead. Okay, this was a talk by the guys at Matisano. It was a really big deal. Talk was standing room only. It was packed. Okay, show of hands, what was the outcome of that talk? What happened? Do virtualized rootkits Are they a danger? Should we worry about them or shouldn't we? So we all know that this thing happened, and I'm sure lots of people attended the talk or downloaded the slides. What did we take away from it? Or in 2011, Charlie Miller did his exploding MacBook battery thing. Show of hands, how many of you saw when Charlie did this? If not the talk, saw the headline for it? So Charlie Miller, exploding batteries. Okay, so I'm guessing almost everyone. Anyone? What was the outcome? 0? Okay. And what I'm interested in here is, again, I'm not slating the researchers. It's important research that needs to be done, and sometimes important research is collecting conferences for 4 years, even though it means absolutely nothing. I've got nothing against basic research. What the researchers are doing is perfectly fine. What I'm questioning is what we're doing as attendees to these talks. Okay, and why we think we've got something out of listening to those talks, when in truth, we walk away and we remember almost nothing. And it's one of the reasons why I say it's an interesting proxy for the security industry, because we often look at clients and say, you know, those guys, they don't want to work on the hard stuff. They want to buy the next box with shiny lights, and they expect it all to go away. And that's exactly what we're doing with these conferences. Okay? It's exactly the same thing, except we don't know it. And it's kind of easy if you asked as an industry whether we're winning. Again, anecdotally, I recently mentioned LulzSec showed us that we didn't know how to defend anything. The recent NSA leaks show us that we don't really know how to attack anything. Because even if you don't like what they're doing, you've got to admit, you look at the NSA ownage and you go like, that's impressive. Like nobody saw reverse lookups on all their data happening for all these years. We haven't found them easily in our stuff. That's cool ass. Okay? And Vincenzo here, who's a respected researcher, CFP, came back and said, look, let's be honest about what you're saying. InfoSec failed. Okay? And I think we can go and ask the NSA their opinion. This is declassified, so for those of you with clearance, you don't have to look away. If you go onto the NSA webpage, they have their old crypto logs. And one of the things that was interesting is, at some point, the guys gave conference reviews for conferences they went to. And these guys went to, I think this was feedback on Eurocrypt. And he basically says, hey, listen, there's nothing interesting going on in Eurocrypt, and that's probably good for us. They bring it up a few times during the text. It's super interesting. It's like the stuff might affect things at some point in the future or in some other world, but really we're quite cool with them not being on the same planet as us. Okay, and so I guess with conference talks, we have to ask why we're sucking. There's questions about the format. It's true that audiences are increasingly more passive. There's more slots to fill. But the one that I keep getting back to is the last one. And that's the push towards conferences as a form of entertainment. Contertainment. But in truth, this contertainment stuff is more insidious than it sounds. Because everyone wants to create a fun conference. Okay? And even the early conferences had, like the TCP/IP drinking game was part of DEF CON 1. But that wasn't all that the conference was about. There was also good, hard technical stuff happening. And increasingly, you're seeing a move towards just the fun stuff. Like there used to be a time you'd go to a conference and there's a lockpicking village. And I get that, and I think it's cool. And now you can go to conferences and there's a DJ village, okay, where you can learn to, I guess, do DJ stuff and Fruit Loops. Okay, and we need to do a check on where the stuff's going. And as attendees, you guys need to do the check on where it's going. You need to make sure that we're not just burning time without getting anything tangible. And as researchers or guys who want to present, it's something that most researchers kind of intuitively know. There's kind of a thing that speakers go through where you kind of get the high of presenting, but at some point, almost everyone knows you kind of stand up on stage and all you're doing is entertaining people for your time slot, and it took you months of preparation and it's probably forgotten by the next coffee. Like, we've built and released tools. and months later had someone in our company say, you know what, you should do this thing with that tool. I'm like, that's why the tool exists. Like, it does that thing. Like, where were you when we gave the talk? Where were you when we built it? Why do we pay you? It's a true thing, and it's something we need to ponder. And as researchers and speakers, you have to start to figure that there's a kind of a fine line, and it kind of feels okay when you think you're Maximus doing a "Are you not entertained?" But in truth, at some point, we also just trained monkeys. Okay, and so one half is demanding entertainment, and the other half dances. Okay, and we need to move past the circus tricks. Okay, we need to start taking research to something with a little more rigor. And again, it's interesting. I don't dislike Charlie. I find him eminently quotable. So Charlie is on the Woot committee, and he was talking about the fact that the academics submitting for Woot never put in references. Okay, and it's something that's true. You always hear about how academia doesn't cite hackers' work. How often do you see hackers citing hackers' work? Okay, we don't do it. It just doesn't happen that often. Black Hat Vegas try more than most conferences to push for this. And if you examine their last few Black Hat Vegases, you see actually kind of a firm trend that says about half of the talks submitted actually have papers that accompany it, and only half of those actually have some form of referencing that would hold up. Okay, and so what you've got is conferences skewing towards entertainment, attendees looking for something that's quick and digestible in an hour. And the question then is, what do researchers want? Like, why are we even presenting? And you'll see a bunch of reasons. Guys want career progression, and guys want fame and fortune. But I think most researchers want to share their research. Okay, they want other people to work on the stuff. And you want to put stuff out and have people build on it. And kind of what I'm saying is that I think conferences may have become the wrong place if that's what you're going for. Okay, and I'm not alone in this. The ACM in 2009 ran this piece that basically says that computer science needs to grow up. Okay, and the academic who was talking there basically says, look, everyone else in the world uses journals for this stuff. Computer science is using conferences for it. It's time for them to move from conferences to journals. And what's interesting here is he says the model has fractured the discipline and skewed it towards short-term, deadline-driven research. Okay, and I think there's something for us to take away from that also. And I guess the question is, were conferences ever the right place for that? Like, is that what goes down at conferences? So a little while back in 2010, we built this thing which basically tries to track the history of memory corruption bugs. So basically anything that's impactful on the memory corruption exploitation scene, going as far back as the original military documents that spoke about it till the time we stopped capturing it. And it allows you to go back and see, well, the things that really shifted the needle. What format did those take? Okay, and what's interesting if you look at it is 23%, by far the biggest percentage of stuff that really made a difference were just people putting papers out. It's not at a conference, it's here's a paper, it's Tim Newsham saying, here's format string attacks in a paper and sending that through. It was guys actually, a lot of it, guys sending stuff to bug track, either as a technique or as part of an advisory. Okay, and just a PPT happening at a conference was just 5% of the stuff. Okay, so a really simple heuristic for you here. If you're submitting to a conference and all you've sent is a PPT, I'm not saying that your stuff's not going to be memorable. I'm just saying chances are, just based on the numbers, it's not one of those things that's going to move the ball forward. Okay, and the question is, are we doing more than just complaining about the stuff? So, quick show of hands, how many of you here have ever been attended, except for this talk, how many of you have ever been annoyed with a conference talk? Hands? Keep your hands up if you submitted feedback on that talk. Okay? You'll find the number annoyingly small. Okay? Last year, we tried to build, or we built a tool to help conferences get speaker feedback. Okay, and we put it out. so everyone can access it on their phone, mobile, whatever. We even tried to incentivize people and gave free iPad to random people giving feedback. And in all of Hack in the Box, Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, I think 10 or 15 people submitted speaker feedback. Okay, and again, like InfoSec, we want to complain about the speakers and we want to complain about conference organizers, but we can't take the time to fill in speaker feedback. Stuff's not going to go away magically. Okay, so quickly to wrap up, I'm going to take something that I took. So I had this in my fig leaf security talk, but given all the stuff that's been going down now with the NSA leaks and with the rise of containment, I thought it was worth bringing up here. I'm not sure if you guys have seen it. At this point, most people have seen. There's a really nice thing. Someone's done a little cartoon on the internet titled Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he contrasts 1984, which at the moment everyone is reading because of what's coming out with the intelligence agencies, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Okay, and the interesting thing that the author does is he comes through and points out that, look, Huxley feared there'd be a time, there'd be people who ban books, and what Huxley feared was that there'd be no reason to ban the books, okay, because nobody would actually want to read one. Okay, and Orwell feared that there'd be those who'd deprive us of information. Huxley feared we'd have so much of information we'd be reduced to passivity and egotism. Okay, Orwell said there'd be people who want to control us by inflicting pain, and Huxley basically said, no, they'll control us by giving us endless amounts of pleasure. Okay, and the short version was, Orwell said that what we hate would ruin us, and what Huxley said was, actually, it's what we love that would ruin us. Okay, and it's something that we need to be cognizant of. I'll skip really quickly. So Tim O'Reilly, again, something that I've often quoted, he went to Web 2.0 and scolded all of the guys there, said, look, our best and brightest are working on beer apps and fart apps for the iPhone. Like where are we going? We're trying to sell ads instead of actually doing stuff that counts. And in lots of his talks, he quotes this poem, which is really nice, and talks about the incident where Jacob was wrestling with the angel. And he gets to this consistently, okay, which is what fights us is so tiny, or what fights us is so great, and when we win, it's with small things, and the victories make us small. Okay, and basically, my premise is that this is what we're doing with research now also. Okay, the stuff that we're attacking is so small, while our privacy is being eroded, while there's problems attacking us from almost everywhere, that it's very little, it's very hard to say that what we're doing is meaningful at all. Okay, so our industry is at an important inflection point. Okay, we've got a crisis of relevance, we've got a crisis of confidence. We couldn't stop LulzSec. We can't stop the guys reading our mail. We can't get guys to adopt a password policy in our businesses. There's really important problems to solve. Some of them are really significantly hard problems. Okay, we don't know how we're going to do supply chain management, secure supply. We don't know how we're going to secure software. There's so many massive problems for us to work on. And kind of what we're doing is pushing towards this thing where the best and brightest spend their time entertaining the rest of the guys for 45-minute slots at a time. So researchers, it's a call to arms to say, let's work on stuff that matters. For attendees, I think the call is, let's start demanding a little more. There's a really interesting quote, if any of you have watched the cartoon Ratatouille, and if you haven't, you should. But at some point, this critic gives a really nice talk, a really nice speech, and he basically says that, look, critics often complain, but critics have one critical role, and that's in the defense of the new, that the new needs friends, okay? And as attendees, it's maybe something that you guys need to start demanding. Demand new faces, and be okay if the guy stutters a little bit on stage, as long as he's showing you quality stuff. You don't need the stuff to all look like a Steve Jobs presentation. You just need to learn stuff. Okay, and for conference organizers, kind of the same thing that I said with my penetration testing talk. You can get pretty far and do pretty well by giving people what they want. But at some point, that line ends. And at some point, you're going to get taken to task for it. And what we need to maybe start doing is give people more of what they need, even if it's not what they're actively asking for at the time. So I've seen the hands up, but I guess I've got a few minutes for questions. So much for passivity and so I'll be around for a while. Like I said, most of the hard parts of the talk were actually done by Marco. I've been stealing his work for years, and I still do it. If you've got any questions, tweet us, mail us. We'd love to hear feedback. Thanks for your time.